From across time and space and throughout the multiverse, listen as two generations of comic book readers come together to discuss a single character or event that shaped pop culture as we know it. Let Your Geek Sideshow presents Then and Now with Susan and Kitty. Hey everyone, welcome to Then and Now. I'm Susan.
And I'm Kitty.
And today we're taking a look at a major Marvel villain who has definitely evolved over the years. Get it? Yeah? Huh? He's proud of his mutant powers and fights to protect his people from a world that fears their strength. So without further ado, let's get drawn into the mastery of magnetism. Magneto, then and now. Yes, we finally got one.
Bum-bum.
Oh my gosh. I was so excited when we decided to do a Magneto Then and Now. Like, I love Magneto. He's such a great character, and there's so many different, like, facets to him that I'm really excited to kind of, like, dig into, like, what makes Magneto tick. Like, what is the through line of Magneto then and now in comics?
Yeah. Whenever I think of X-Men characters, primarily like the OG kind of.
Oh, Magneto is the OG.
I just start hearing the theme song for the animated series in my head.
Na 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 na.
So that's going to be going through my head this whole time. And
I wish we could play that. Like, we should just play it in the background. No.
Might run into a copyright issue.
Yeah, there's a little bit of an issue there.
Just imagine it, if you will.
Yeah. You all know it. If you're listening to this podcast, you know it. Awesome. So where's Magneto right now? I actually haven't picked up a comic where he was kind of even in it since like early 2000s. Let's do that.
Okay. So it's actually interesting because in the most current moment, he's kind of been a bit player in a lot of events that involve the X-Men because he is such a monolith of the mutant mythos, I guess. Like I
love that. The monolith of the mutant mythos.
Magneto.
Hashtag.
There's so many M's that you can.
Oh, I love it.
But yeah, it's interesting because a lot of the way that I see Magneto right now is through actually the newer generations of X-Men characters, particularly like Gen X and the newest Gen X, and how these characters treat this kind of legendary figure, even within the world of their own fiction.
That's crazy. Because like when I think of Magneto, first off, I think that Chris Claremont should write Magneto for always. Like even into the ether of the world, like there should always be Chris Claremont Magneto out there. Like that should exist. But I come from the time when like Magneto was like on the ground battling. So it's like almost. It's funny to listen to the fact that he's elevated beyond that now because he was so in the nitty gritty of it when he was a fighter.
Yeah, and so when I think of Magneto right now in the context of current X-Men comics, I think of a young punkish Quentin Quire with his pink hair wearing Magneto t-shirts, ironically, because that's what he does. Because he's kind of like an anti-establishment character. He's a super powerful mutant, but he wears shirts that say Magneto was right. He's worn a shirt that says Swagneto.
Oh my god.
So
is it weird that I find like I feel like the old person who's like way to be disrespectful. Like
it's interesting because that's how I see it, and it's like, oh my goodness, for these newer X-Men characters, he is a figure of their pop culture, which is weird to think of pop culture within the world of the X-Men, but
it does happen because now we're talking about generations of mutants who have come forth, and we even have like mutants from Wakanda now too in certain storylines. So it's really cool to think about the first generation, like the mutants who laid on the barbed wire so that other mutants could wear t-shirts like that. Like,
whoa,
it's really morbid to think about, but there has to be that first generation that fights so the next generation can live a little bit easier.
Yeah, and he's still doing that in the comics, but I think there is a lot more room for other characters to play, and it's really cool to see how those characters are inspired either by Magneto's philosophy or Professor X or other ways of mutant life.
I don't think there's like a way to discuss Magneto accurately without bringing in Professor X into the mix. Like you kind of have to use them in opposition to each other in terms of their ideals, but at the same time, you have to understand that they both have different experiences. So it's about when you look at them, you have to look at life experience. Like, were you in the trenches, literally, or did you come from privilege? Like, how that shapes your worldview and your political views and your ideologies. So one of the turning points for me, and one of the reasons I love Magneto, is because I love characters that aren't all one thing. Like, I don't like characters that, like, well, they're always going to destroy the world every time they show up. Magneto obviously has destroyed a lot of things, killed a lot of people, but Magneto isn't always the bad guy.
No.
He fights for a common cause along with the X-Men a lot, especially when you have Sentinels and people trying to, like, governments trying to wipe out the mutant race. So to me, it's fascinating to see a character like Magneto evolve even in his, like, personality, more so than just being like the next evolution of the human race.
Right. Yeah, and so going back to you talk about he destroys a lot of things, and including there's always humans who don't like the mutants. There's the Sentinels. So it was really interesting because I think the last really big Magneto-centric storyline that happened in comics recently was about 2014, 2015. He actually had a solo series that culminated as, and I think I bring this up in every Marvel Then and Now podcast that we've done. But if you haven't read the Jonathan Hickman's Secret Wars, everything kind of hinges off that moment.
Oh my gosh. Like, I feel like we couldn't continue to do this podcast if I read Secret Wars, because then I'd know what you were talking about. But I really do want to read Secret Wars now.
So for those of you playing along with your bingo cards, I'm going to talk about Secret Wars again. So this series actually happened before, and this was it was called Magneto. That was the single or the solo series. It led into the event of Secret Wars, and so a lot of series around that time have arcs called The Last Days of, and so this is the last days of Magneto. And so he's been through the Axis storyline by now, which I'll get into a little bit later for what that meant for his character. But he's at a point right now where actually a lot of humans think he's really cool. And of course, the mutants think he's really cool. And as Secret Wars is about to occur, it's the ultimate Earth about to collide with the 616. Like, the planets are literally headed towards each other. And so he, with his daughter Polaris, decide we have to protect this Earth. It's the 616 Magneto. We have to protect this Earth. And that means he's fighting off Sentinels from the ultimate Earth. And he's actually trying to destroy the ultimate universe to protect his Earth. He knows that he can't win with everybody. Not everyone loves him, but he's in a pretty good place as people viewing him as an important figure.
That's so cool because, again, if you're playing along with your bingo cards, I always talk about through lines of characters. Magneto is a highly logical character. He's always forward thinking, regardless of whether or not you agree with what his future entails. But the fact that he would decide he always picks a side. Like, he decided, you're saying, to protect the 616 and allow the ultimate universe to be destroyed, and took part in destroying it.
Yes. Unfortunately, he didn't completely succeed. And so he and everyone end up enwrapped in the incursion, which is what puts everyone onto Battleworld where Secret Wars takes place. But to see that, it was really cool that he kind of put the mutant-human divide aside and said, this is now about worlds. And so for the greater good of a world, he was fighting Sentinels and other heroes from a rival Earth just to make sure that people would survive. And he unfortunately was destroyed in the incident and then regenerated in Secret Wars and in the Battleworld area. But I thought that was really cool because in this pop culture of the X-Men, it's always, Magneto will do anything to keep the mutants on top, even if that means destroying humans. But in this moment, he made a different choice.
It's funny because in another storyline from the 80s, it was called God Loves, Man Kills. And it was another instance where Magneto teams up with the X-Men to... Mostly because the X-Men saw the threat of the humans and saw what the humans were headed towards. And they start asking themselves, is Magneto right in this scenario? Is Magneto is his philosophy the the type of philosophy that will protect us or the type of philosophy that will destroy us. So it was one of the first times that you saw Professor X and the X-Men team come to Magneto's side because of all of the devastation that humanity was causing. And you wind up seeing exactly what we were talking about as mutants as the next level. And what does that mean for humans? And humans are trying to protect themselves, and everyone goes into survival mode essentially. And you see all of the X-Men and Magneto on one side. And you will recognize a lot of these elements of the story were borrowed for X2 in the X-Men movies. But this was a Chris Claremont story from the 80s that's pretty cool.
So now, going off of where Magneto draws the line between himself and others, recently in the comics, there's been another divide, not just mutant and human. There's been the mutants versus the Inhumans. So that was actually a big storyline. He featured in that, but he wasn't one of the biggest players in that, because this series actually saw the rise of Emma Frost deciding to become a villain again. But what was fascinating was she decided in her villainy to take the iconography of Magneto, because there's a panel that went around when the series came out of her putting on a new helmet she's designed, and it looks like Magneto's helmet, but it's got the crosses of, or it's got the red X for like Cyclops kind of deal. And so this was an event, if you don't know what happened recently, the Inhumans are formed with Terrigen mist, like they kind of awaken, and then mutants have the X gene. And so people were finding out that the Terrigen mist was reacting negatively to bodies with the X gene. And so the mutants' bodies were kind of destroying themselves. And so a bunch of mutants were dying. And so it kind of launched a full-scale conflict between the Inhumans and the X-Men, resolved with Medusa actually destroying the Terrigen cloud so that mutants could survive. The conflict had been largely manipulated by Emma Frost, who believed there was no time to go to negotiations. We just had to start a war.
Wow.
And so it was interesting. So Magneto was in that, but we really got to see Emma Frost taking parts of Magneto's ideologies and then using that to go up against another race of Marvel superheroes.
That's crazy. It's really difficult for me to think of the X-Men and the Inhumans in the same type of storyline, even though they are very similar types of characters. You know, it's like the born versus bred type of situation where it's like the mist awakens powers versus like we were born this way. So it's a very interesting thing to have in comics and to address in comics. And Magneto's always been at the forefront of these two different types of forward thinking. Like we were born this way, therefore we are supposed to be this way. So like that's Magneto's kind of creed, if you think about it. Like, you know, mutant and proud. Like he's very proud of everything that has been given to him, and he uses his powers in a way that like this is so controversial because I like Magneto as a character. I do not think of him as being a bad guy, because I think that if he is a mutant and he's proud of being a mutant, then he should do what he can to protect that situation.
Sometimes his methods are a little unorthodox.
His methods are awful. He should definitely not do any, like I have to, in order for me to like Magneto the way that I like Magneto, I have to think of him in terms of his, what he believes instead of what he does. So in a way, I'm exactly like the new generation of the mutants who look at him as a mythological figure rather than this horrible, like, killer and mass murderer, because that's what he has done for years and years and years. That he even went on trial at one point because of how he behaved, and at that point he had been like a full-fledged good guy for a while, but he still had to answer for all of the lives that he had taken from the humans, because the thing is like we're supposed to be living together, we're not supposed to be living apart. Like that's, if you're talking about the X-Men, that's what they believe. Like, we are all on this earth together. Let's protect each other and live in harmony. So, we want Magneto on that team. It benefits all sides to have someone with such passion and such like core amazing beliefs on that side. You probably shouldn't do the things that Magneto does, though, in order to get there. So to see him go on trial was actually very refreshing, because it was kind of one of the first times you saw a character who was bad, who turned good, who had to answer for his crimes. Like, you did do all of this. Mm-hmm. Explain yourself, and you have to accept the responsibility for and punishment for everything that you've done.
So, speaking of bad guy turning good, the 2014 comic book, or like 2013-2014 series, Axis literally flipped a bunch of characters on their heads in terms of their alignments. And one of the biggest parts of this conflict was actually that Red Skull got a hold of Professor X's brain and was using it and he had his powers, and he became Red Onslaught. And so he was using those powers to become a villain. And Magneto was actually on the side of heroes who flipped to good.
Awesome. I love it.
And so there were...
Tell me more.
So there were a number of mutants who actually swapped their alignments. I can't remember for the life of me right now the catalyzing incident that caused this flip. Probably had something to do with Charles's brain, but
I mean, I imagine once someone steals Charles's brain, that's kind of an action that would set forth any kind of conflict.
But it was actually pretty funny, because a lot of major villains you saw turning good. This was when we saw Loki actually picking up Thor's hammer. Captain America, the new Captain America Falcon, actually showed up as a bad guy, and so it was really interesting who got kind of flipped on their axis here. I wonder why they called that storyline Axis. So we saw the betrayal of certain mutants in this situation. Havoc turned bad and actually stayed bad after this event.
Havoc always had that in him, though, if you think about it. Like, if you really think about who Havoc is and his bloodline and where he came from, like, that guy always was... He was going to snap at some point. He was a time bomb.
Yeah. And
just going to say it.
Another one of the characters who actually ended up being quite an antagonist in this incident was Scarlet Witch.
I know.
So I wanted to talk to you about, because I know.
Oh, no.
I know this. So
I didn't read the storyline, so that I'm going to preface it with that. I've kept up on Scarlet Witch, so I know a little bit about what happened, but I don't know the details because I have not read the storyline for our audience.
I wanted to talk to you a little bit about now on the Now side of things. I mean, I knew their relationship, the familial relationship that Magneto has had with Quicksilver and Scarlet Witch. This event was kind of controversial in the fact that Wanda is all crazy angry, and so she tries to enact a magic curse that will only affect members of her bloodline. And when Quicksilver drops to the ground writhing in pain, but Magneto is standing on his own 2 feet, everyone was like, what the heck just happened? And they revealed that Scarlet Witch and Quicksilver are not descended of Magneto. Polaris is still related, but that bloodline kind of that everybody just... I took it for granted. It was kind of there.
It was like, if you figured out that somehow William wasn't Charles's son. Like, I'm going, that's correct for the Brits, right? Anyway.
I was thinking Charles Xavier. I was like, what?
Oh, no. I was thinking like Prince or, William and I don't know. Anyway, bad Susan. Anyway, I tried to do something and I failed.
Stick to the pop culture.
Stick to pop culture. You don't know England. Anyway.
But you don't need to comment on because what's happened now with that revelation is happening. But I want to see what the then side of things was.
For me,
why did this upset so many people?
For me, Scarlet Witch is always going to be Magneto's daughter. Like that's just the ins and outs of it. I know that it was undone in comics. I know that it was undone in the MCU. But to me, Polaris is her sister, and they never get along because Wanda's kind of like the sister that doesn't get it, and Polaris is the sister that does. And to me, that's how it is, because for so long, we're talking like decades and decades and decades, she was his daughter. So that's like pulling the rug under any character. It's like finding out Thor isn't related to Odin. Like it's I remember reading about it on one of my comic book websites that I check news from, even though I'm not entirely caught up on current books, and just going, well, now I have no reason to care about this. Like, I don't know how else to explain it. Like in the then side of things, Magneto is Scarlet Witch's father. That's the bottom line, and that's the truth, and there's no undoing that for me.
and I think it goes along with Magneto and his mythos just being so ingrained in X-Men stories.
Yeah.
I acknowledge, I'm like, oh yeah, this happened, this reversion of their bloodline happened, but it does still feel that same way to me. I'm like, of course you've got him and his lovely children with their strange mutant powers.
Yeah, and I loved, I'm sorry to say this, but I loved House of M. So I loved Scarlet Witch using her power in this like completely horrific way. The no more mutants thing is terrible, and she did it for completely selfish reasons, But to me, like that even backed up the fact that she is of Magneto, because Magneto does a lot of things for completely selfish reasons. Like he's
like, oh, you got that from your father.
Yeah, like so many things are just like complete self-interest, and you can't like kind of backpedal away from them. So something that Scarlet Witch and Magneto have in common is this like doing a horrible thing and having to backpedal through it, and then having to accept the consequence and move forward. And that's what allows them both to fall on both sides of the coin. Both of them have been really good, and both of them have been really awful. And I think that that's what makes a well-rounded and very healthy character, is the ability to do that. And something that Marvel in general does really well is hold characters accountable for their actions, even if their actions are in a comic book world.
Yeah.
It's crazy.
and I like that, because in the continuity you can see, I mean, that's how there is like a mutant pop culture, and that's how there are all these instances in which Magneto is a very visible, he's either down on the ground doing what he does to protect the mutants, or he becomes a figure that the younger mutants are referencing.
It's like an inspiration. Like you build a statue to the person that inspires you, to the person who holds the ideology that you have. And while Magneto, again, history gets blurred, and when history is repeated over and over again, it's not exactly how it happened. So I'm sure the younger generation of mutants aren't getting, the horrible stuff. They're getting the good stuff and the way he fought for their ideals that they currently have, and not the way he did it in the past.
Right.
But that's what you do. I mean, it's not good, but it happens.
Yeah. And so in relegating him to that kind of like how Marvel, he hasn't had a solo series since the end with Secret Wars there in 2015, and he has appeared in all these other events, but he hasn't been the main focus. And I think that's good for now. I mean, I'd love to see him focus more in something, but
I actually think that's good now too, for just comics in general. Like we need to get a new generation of comic book readers.
Yeah.
And the new generation of comic book readers has to love their characters the way we loved the characters we loved.
Yeah.
So we can have Magneto, and I hope that comic book readers who are new do pick up Magneto and love him the way that I've loved him. But I also hope that they find a character that has their ideology and maybe doesn't kill a whole bunch of people to get there.
Yeah, and it allows Marvel a lot of fun chances to play with new mutant characers. Not new mutant characters.
Yeah, no,
but
I know.
Yeah,
I got
additional ones.
I got it.
Good, because you never know when you accidentally slap an adjective before one of these superhero team names.
Because then it's like, that's actually another book. We're talking about an entirely different thing now.
Yeah, but it allows a lot of diversity of powers and different, like even we've got a mutant from Wakanda now, so you get to open the world up and see how they react to their own history.
While keeping the history. That's exactly what I was going to say. So if fans are looking to read some Magneto comics current comics, they're not really current, but because current would be ongoing now. But
he doesn't have a solo series right now. But
Kitty understands me.
Yes. If you do want to read some of the more modern Magneto stories, if you pick up Axis, that's definitely a big one. I don't know how they collected that event into trades, but there is Magneto Axis. The Magneto solo series from 2014, definitely the last days of Magneto. That's the last volume in that collection. And then probably most recently, if you want the most relevant one that he's featured in Inhumans versus X-Men, because that, even though he's not a major player, you can see how Emma Frost is taking his ideology into her own mutant philosophy.
Anyway, that's my thing.
And so if they're looking for the classic stuff.
For the classic stuff, I would say pick up anything that features Magneto that has written by Chris Claremont on it. Chris Claremont is that guy. But for me, you'd want to pick up The Trial of Magneto from 1985. I don't really know how it's collected, but The Trial of Magneto is what I was talking about in terms of Magneto's good, but he does have to account for the bad things that he's done. I would also pick up God Loves, Man Kills. It's an X-Men storyline, and it also features Magneto, also written by Chris Claremont, and I, Magneto. That's just a really good storyline, and it's the first time that he actually wasn't all bad and just kind of the gray area type anti-hero. So, that's what I would go for the then side. So you can go pro-mutant at your local comic book store to pick up these Magneto books and more. I did not mean for that to rhyme, but it did. Thank you so much for sticking with us today, because that's Magneto Then and Now. This has been Then and Now. For more ad-free pop culture news and content, visit geeksideshow.com. Thank you for listening, and don't forget to let your geek side show.